Yahmesu Ahmose I, the king who liberated Egypt. Yahmesu Ahmose's Louvre Museum. When he was almost 20 years old, Yahmesu ruled the country and legitimized his kingship through his marriage to his sister Yahmesu Nefertiti Ahmose I, who inherited from her grandmother and mother. The crowning name of the new king was Nefertiti, which means the master of the power of God. Nefertiti Yahmesu began the work of his life restoring Egyptian power. Yahmesu attacked the Hyksos in the Nile Delta and took over Uluno Heliopolis. He went down the eastern delta and captured the city of Jaro, blocking the way the foreign army was supplied from the land of Canaan, what is now the Middle East. The occupation king Khamit tried to negotiate, but Yahmesu was uncompromising. The Egyptian army, which was powerful again at that time and has been recorded by its victories since Yahmesu was the king, conquered the capital Avaris from Hyksos after several battles. The fortified inmates' headquarters collapsed under attacks by Africans. Khamit ran away towards the land of Canaan, where he hoped to bring Egypt back. Yahmesu decided to destroy his enemies to the last, entered the Middle East and besieged the city of Sharuhe, which is currently between Rafah and Gaza, for several years. So he was able to bring down the last resistance of Hyksos. A former enemy collaborator tried to create a rebellion in the northern part of Egypt. The queen mother Akotpu put down the rebellion. Egypt was liberated after 200 years of occupation. Queen Yahmesu Nefertiti Museo Agizu Torino. Pharaoh established order and was ruthless with those who dealt with the intruders. The African Caribbean historian Nusere Kalala John Philippe Omatumbe tells us that Hebrews may have come to Egypt in Hyksos time. When the land was liberated, Yahmesu was particularly uncompromising with them. This could be the origin of the greatly exaggerated myth of the slavery of the Jews in Egypt, who have never built a single pyramid. Yahmesu consolidated the country's western borders, which were shared with Libya. Eventually he conquered Nubia by Kakaure Sen-Oriseret, Sesostris III, before him Djehuty-Mesu, Thutmose III, Ramesu Narimana, and Ramesses II after him, where he appointed a viceroy to lead him. With his wife he created the most famous and prestigious Egyptian dynasty, the 18th of which included Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, Amenhotep III, Akhenaten, and Tutankhamun. Yahmesu, Manchester Museum. Yahmesu appointed trustworthy men to rule provinces, revived the economy through trade and mining. Wasat became the capital of the country. He enriched Egypt with the religious centers. After 25 years of rule, it is a free Egypt with restored borders, which Nefertiti Yahmesu and Yahmesu Nefertiti left to their daughter Akotpu and the pharaoh Joseph-Kare Amenhotep I, their son. Yahmesu is therefore an absolute main leader in black history. Definitions: the first black civilians in Europe. 3,500 years ago, these people of African descent came to Greece, brought Europe into history, and introduced writing there. This article is our second on the old blacks who dominated the Mediterranean. In the first we show that the Carthaginians, descendants of the Phoenicians, were black. A Phoenician Cadiz Museum, Spain. We can now trace the genealogy of these civilizers. The first men were born in the Great Lakes and southern Africa. From these first people came the ancient Egyptians. From the ancient Egyptians came the Canaanites, who were the first inhabitants of the Middle East, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine. The Phoenicians came from the Canaanites. And from the Phoenicians came the Carthaginians, founders of the brilliant republic in ancient Tunisia. It will never be emphasized enough that Greece, considered the cradle of European civilization, was civilized by the Africans, that is, the Phoenicians and Egyptians. This is a fact that Europe knows and hides. It is added that Thales himself was a Phoenician, so there is a high possibility that he was black. In this article we are going to give faces to the Phoenicians. The sculptures you will see were found in their colonies in Greece, Italy, Spain and Carthage. With the exception of the first by Cadmus, all of our images are from the University of Oxford collection. 2,600-year-old amphora found near Athens in Greece. It is preserved in the Musée du Louvre in France. We see Cadmus facing a snake. According to ancient Greek tradition, Cadmus is the one who was most likely to lead the Phoenicians in Greece. The Greeks said that it was he, as a symbol of the Phoenicians, who introduced writing in his country. Cadmus was undoubtedly black. Here we see the Phoenicians portraying themselves as the Egyptian parents. On the left is Isata Isis, in the middle Hathor, and on the right Maat. Phoenicians based on the Egyptian model. Phoenician black and white heads. It should be known that as migration progressed in Europe, the Phoenicians integrated the white peoples into their midst. While the famous Carthaginian general Hannibal was black, his brother-in-law Hadrusbar was so the fair of whites, probably from Spain. 3 black and 1 white head. Except for the white one on the right, all heads are black. More white men. These likely originated in the Middle East itself. The Phoenicians will mix with the massive arrival of whites in the region, hence the fact that their language was Semitic, not African. But still they were of great black supremacy when they traveled through Europe and ruled Carthage. The Phoenicians also always practiced African spirituality. 3 black hats, the rounds on the head similar to the pharaoh's military helmets, represent the curly hair. Taharqa, the last great king of the Nile. In 1090 BC, Egypt sank into anarchy. The numerous captured and enslaved white intruders managed to break free and devastated the native black authority in the north of the country. The legitimate power and the clergy fled to the south. White Libyans and nations established small kingdoms in the delta and established a feudal power. Pharaoh Taharqa leads the procession during the Opet ceremony. Man jets the solar boats, which depicts God's routes in the sky, was exposed for the occasion. The king is dressed in a cat skin like all African chiefs, illustration from National Geographic. For 300 years, Damer Egypt was in chaos. In this context, the clergy of Waset Stebes appealed to the king of the land of ancestors, the Sudanese Pianki, for help. He came to Egypt and conquered the delta. His brother Shabaka, who followed him, continued to recapture the delta, to the applause of the Egyptian people who saw him as a legitimate ruler. Persistent tensions with Aisha put General Taharqa, son of Pianki, at the forefront of history, a man whose rule marked the rebirth and decline of the land of pharaohs. Egypt fought against the Syrians in Asia and responded to the cry for help from the Jews threatened by the enemy. Taharqa with 200,000 men came to Asia and saved the Jews in Jerusalem, but later he was defeated by the Assyrians and retired in Egypt after his army was betrayed by the foreign peoples of the Delta. Taharqa sacrifices Horus Hora, his totemistic equivalent, to the pharaoh Muzida-Luvra. After murdering Pharaoh Shabataka, Taharqa Sari Maramani, Taharqa, son and loved by God, was crowned king of Egypt and Sudan in 3547 of the African era, 689 BC. One of his names was Kuitawi, that is, the one who protects the 2 countries, Upper and Lower Egypt. He proclaimed himself the son of courage, the feminine part of God. Despite its defeat in Asia, the partially restored military power of Egypt allowed Taharqa to complete the work of its predecessors by dominating the foreigners of the north in significant ways. Taharqa, British Museum. He did not hesitate to deport to Sudan the wives and children of those who questioned his authority. He militarized Egyptian society heavily, frequently responding to the Assyrian attacks. He intervened in Asia to restore Egypt's lost dominance in the region. Sudan and Egypt experienced exceptional economic prosperity and cultural revitalization for 20 years. Taharqa was characterized by gigantic architectural work in the empire. Betrayed once again by the foreigners of the north, Egypt was invaded by the Assyrians. The pharaoh took refuge in Sudan, from where he again launched an offensive with great energy and recaptured his country. 3 years later he was repelled and fled to Sudan, where he died. His successors, the Sudanese Bakaret and Tamani, son of Shabataka, took over the land again before he saw the Assyrians fall on Thebes, which they relished. The violent destruction of the most sacred, untouchable, venerable, and perennial capital of the Black World caused a terrible shock. From then on, Egypt weakened. The waves of Egyptian migration to the rest of Africa really began, and the land of the pharaohs gradually came under the rule of many invaders, until the Arabs took it over in 640 AD. As for Taharqa, his military ability to defend and restore for the last time the land that civilized humanity made him the last great king of the Nile Valley. The gigantic structure of Taharqa is the largest religious building in human history, the Temple of Karnak in Egypt. Karnak was dedicated to the worship of Allah, Imana, Amen, Amen, Yamin, Nyamba, Nzambi, etc., the unique god of Africa. The Temple of God at the base of Gebel Barkal, Sudan, built by Taharqa, source reconstruction of learning locations. Ruins of the Temple of God in Kawa in Sudan, built by Taharqa. Yes, we know today that Taharqa led his armies to Spain. The Afro-Guyan historian Ivan I Septima, in the Golden Age of the Moor, page 2, reports on the writings of Florian de Ocampo, the 16th century Spanish historian and the author of Chronicle General. There the presence in Spain of a man named Taharqa is mentioned, who is at the head of his Ethiopian armies, that is Sudanese, who later became king of Egypt. P.S. 2. We know today that the Sudanese first helped the Libyans to maintain their power over Egypt, and that the Libyan dynasty was predominantly black. That probably explains why it didn't cause the Sudanese hostility. Therefore, although they were undoubtedly white foreigners who later played a role in the Assyrian invasion of Egypt, the events of the 22nd dynasty up until Shubaka came to power were internal African struggles. Djehuty-Mesu Thutmose III, the greatest African of all time. Menkeperi Djehuty-Mesu, Temple of Deir el-Bahari. The birth name of the great king was Djehuty-Mesu Nefek-Heperu, which means the one who was born of Djehuty, Thoth, whose future is perfect. He is the son of Aissata, Sudanese royal wife, the pharaoh Djehuty-Mesu Nefekau, Thutmose II. When he was 5 years old, when his father died, was his stepmother and the sister of his father, the great royal spouse and ruler of Egypt, Queen Hatshepsut, who was responsible for accompanying the king's child in the exercise of power. Since Hatshepsut had the matriarchal legitimacy of power according to African tradition, she exercised power completely and was crowned pharaoh. On January 14th, 1458, after the death of the queen, Djehuty-Mesu Nefekeperu was appointed king of Tameri, which means beloved land, Egypt, under the name of Menkepere. May the transformation of matter by God continue. He was 29 years old. Menkepere Djehuty-Mesu, Metropolitan Museum. Tameri was then under constant threat from neighboring peoples who tried to take possession of the land. Since the denied invasion of the Hyksos under King Yahmesu, Ahmose, in response to an attack, Egypt became an imperialist country under Djehuty-Mesu. From the moment he ascended the throne, armed with the sword of justice and truth and carried by Imanu God, in 20 years he waged 17 campaigns without being defeated and built his legacy. Djehuty-Mesu entered Asia with 10,000 men and won the battle in Aruna, Megiddo, Palestine, and Jaffa, Phoenicians. His wars against Mitanni, Iraq, were the toughest. The Tannis on the other side of the Euphrates and the Egyptians had the challenge of crossing it. The king ordered the construction of boats and bidders and Jaffa, which were then brought through the desert to the Euphrates. The Mitanni troops, believed to be protected by the river, were surprised by the naval attack on the coast. Djehuty-Mesu crushes his enemies, the engraving of the Temple of Karnak. Crete, Cyprus, Babylonians, Libyans, and Diwan, very known Hittites, Turkish faced the pharaoh. All the kings of the conquered territories rushed to give their daughters in marriage to the African king as a token of loyalty. Through the contact between the Hittites and the Egyptians, the language of the first became the first written Indo-European language in history. Finally, Djehuty-Mesu, the son of Aissata, led a campaign in Nubia, Sudan, the land of his ancestors. He was distinguished there by considerable architectural work, and Nubia became part of the Egyptian Empire, which then extended to Iraq. The spoils of war made Tamera richer, and the empire reached its political climax. Djehuty-Mesu brought the geographical expansion of the pharaonic civilization to its maximum and forced Africa to become the first world power. The pharaoh died at the age of 64. The only man who can be compared to him is Ramesu Marimana, Ramesses II. Menkeperi Djehuty-Mesu arrived in the picture, Temple of Deir el-Bahari. Mami Venkepere Djehuty-Mesu, source National Geographic. Yinidi Ititi Kekuru Jahi. I have come, I allow you to defeat the princes of Jahi, Phoenicians. I throw them on your feet over them lands. I let them see your majesty covered with your spoils of wool. When you take your arm on your chariots, Yinidi Tikita Yabeti. I have come, I allow you to conquer the western land, Khamit, Crete, and pass the Cyprus. Under your terror, I let them see your majesty like a young bull with a strong heart, with his horns that could not be resisted. Yinidi Itidi Kamimu Nebutson. Thou Mumijin Sedao Kirs and Juka. I have come, I allow you to defeat the people, to defend themselves at their ports, and the regions of Mitanni tremble under your terror. I let them see your majesty like the hippopotamus, lord of terror on the water that one might approach. Yinidi Ititi Kayaktu Seki. I have come, I allow you to defeat the barbarians of Nubia. Everything is in your hand, up to the land of Punt. I let you see your majesty like two brothers, Horus and Sute, Horus and Seth. I have raised my arms to secure power. Menkepere Djehuty-Mesu, illustration by Antonio Wade for Ahmose I.